Welcome to episode 40 of The Checklist, brought to you by Secure Mac. I'm Ken Ray.
I'm Nicholas Raba.
And I'm Nicholas Tocek.
Ransomware, malware, dedicated denial of service attacks. Those are the kind of things we tend to think of when somebody says the word hacker today. That's not what the word used to mean, though. Hacker culture used to be pretty benign and actually kind of fun. In fact, it's thanks to the hackers of yesteryear that we have a lot of the technology that we have today. In fact, without that hacker culture, we wouldn't have Apple. We're doing a bit of hacker history on today's checklist, looking at Apple's hacker roots and how that led to the ever-growing Apple ecosystem. Items on checklist number 40, Apple's hacker roots, what the freak is freaking. We'll look at Captain Crunch, the Blue Box, and the early days of Apple. We'll look at the role of the Homebrew Computer Club. And finally, we'll check the current health of the early hacker spirit. Now, there are countless websites covering Apple, a number of podcasts, books written about the history of Apple, hundreds of stores owned by Apple, thousands of other stores that sell Apple stuff. There are iPhones, iPads, computers. There are R&D centers around the planet, billions upon billions of dollars in the bank, and a market cap that some people think will hit $1 trillion in the next few years. Just as the Disney empire began with the drawing of a mouse, Apple's beginnings were really incredibly humble.
Yeah, Apple was once a simple startup company operated out of a garage, scrambling to make a name for itself in the tech world. While Apple boasts a highly polished and refined image today, it wasn't always like that. The company built its early image around the hacking and phreaking scenes. It's important to remember what computer systems were like back in the late 1970s. When we talk about this period in Apple's history, it's easy to forget how basic computers were back then compared to the ones they have today. Now we have machines that instantly work out of the box with little user setup. Now flashback to this. The Apple I came without a keyboard, without a screen, without anything. It was practically a naked circuit board. You had to put the rest together yourself. That on its own should tell you something about the relationship between early Apple and the hacker ethos. Consider that this was originally made to impress friends in a club. It all flowed from a desire to experiment and push the envelope of technology to see what was possible. There was an almost literal element to the word hacking here when Steve Wozniak approached the challenge of building a brand new computer. Even as Steve Jobs began to lay out his vision for selling the machines in larger batches and eventually developing new products, those challenges remained. A lot of hacking together of hardware and software components is what propelled Apple to fame. And it wouldn't be inaccurate to call the 70s and 80s the Wild West of the computer age. There was no end to innovation and competition across the country. Computers weren't just new, they were exciting. The possibilities seemed endless, but you had to get your hands dirty to make the machines do what you wanted them to do. Parts and plans, they were swapped, ideas were kicked around freely, and the sharing of information, it was widely encouraged. In fact, Bill Gates even published an open letter blasting how often hobbyists in the community shared software without ever paying for it in the first place. Apple's early team embraced and embodied this pirate spirit of scrappy, we-can-do-it-ourselves optimism, even as the company grew. In 1983, Jobs told the team working under him that it's better to be a pirate than join the Navy. Apple was growing, and in some ways, it was leaving behind the experimental era of phone phreaking and hacking. But knowing this, Jobs still wanted to keep that pirate spirit alive. After all, Apple was still a small company in a marketplace crowded with power players like IBM. If he could motivate his team by calling back to their roots, he would. As a symbol of this determination to stay on the cutting edge and avoid the pressure to go mainstream, a black pirate flag actually flew above Apple's building for a while. While Apple no longer flies that flag, the fact that it once did is a potent reminder of Apple's humble and very human beginnings.
All right, so you almost did like a prologue there. Like, yes, we have this gigantic company today, but once upon a time, there was this much smaller thing with a very different spirit. I mean, okay, so there was the spirit, but I mean, what were the actual events that played a part in developing the first Apple computers? Like, well, I'll just go ahead and get to it. I said earlier that we're going to talk about what the freak is freaking. There are actually two spellings of freak and freaking in there. There's F-R-E-A-K, what the freak, is P-H-R-E-A-K, freaking. What is that? Why is it important? And what does it have to do with Apple?
Well, to understand more about how and why Apple came to be a symbol of this rebellious portion of the computer community, we kind of have to dive deeper into the whole history back then. You've heard of hacking, of course. We have talked about it a bit on this podcast. But what about freaking? Well, it is a kind of combination. It's a combination between the words phone and freak, F-R-E-A-K. And that kind of gives a little bit of a clue as to what it's about. It's an activity centered around the telephone system. It was kind of once considered the hacking of its day before personal computers had reached that affordable and ubiquitous level that they have now. So it's no longer really relevant this day and age, but freaking was once a thriving community of hobbyists and technologically skilled individuals back in the 70s and 80s. I mean, just think about it. Before the rise of the internet and the spread of email and instant communications, the phone network was the primary means of communicating with other people. So, of course, this also meant that the telephone companies wielded an enormous amount of power. Now, it wasn't like today, where you can just grab your cell phone and call anyone, anywhere in the world at a moment's notice. Long-distance charges were standard back then, and they were quite pricey, and international calls were prohibitively expensive for most people. So freaking was born, in part, out of a desire to sidestep the need to actually pay the phone company. At its root, freaking was all about exploring and understanding the telephone network. Much like later hackers would probe the early business computer networks and later on the internet itself, there was a lot of curiosity about how telephone systems worked. After transition away from human operators, switchboards were replaced by mechanical analog switches. Automatic switchboards would make call routing much easier, but there needed to be a way to control and manipulate these switches. So as a result, the phone companies relied on a series of tones and sounds. The right sound could trigger a switch to perform a certain function. So you could think of it as entering a command on a computer, only in this case the command takes the form of audio rather than some text you're typing with the keyboard. It used to be that when you dialed the phone, especially for making a long-distance call, you could often hear some or all of these tones in the background. Freakers spent a lot of time learning about and exploring these tones. Now here's the kicker. With the right know-how, you could trick the phone system into thinking you were one of the signaling devices that were issuing the control tones. One of the most common methods for doing this, which we'll discuss a bit more in depth a little bit, was the use of the 2600 Hz tone. This tone told any listening telephone switch that the line was idle and ready for reuse. So it didn't take very long for freakers to figure out how to exploit this to make free phone calls. You might start by calling a distant toll-free number and then introduce the tone onto the telephone line. The tone would tell the switch that the line was idle and no call was active. You would then dial the next series of numbers you wanted to call, and the switch would interpret that to place the call. But since you never hung up the phone, that call was now free. You weren't paying the phone company for it. At the time, you could easily use this method to place calls all around the world. With the right setup, it was possible to loop through circuits all around the globe, exploring the furthest reaches of the phone network. Phreaking extended outside of this area as well. Some tones could trick a payphone into thinking someone had deposited a quarter into its coin slot, for example. Other phreakers built their own telephones or modified the lines going into their own homes to allow them to place an endless amount of free calls. Now, strictly speaking, the majority of this wasn't legal at all. Now, that rarely stopped any of its participants, even as those who took their fun too far drew the attention of the FBI and other law enforcement agencies at that time.
Man, I'm thinking about the movie Hackers right now with the scene in the club, picking up the payphone, playing those tones into it, getting free calls. Where did they call?
Oh, I don't even remember. Venezuela?
Well, there's a story. I don't know how true the story is, but there's a story that Woz and Jobs called the Vatican.
I think we're actually going to cover that one here soon.
Oh, see, again, I do the whole thing where I didn't read ahead.
It just means we're all on the same page.
I guess so. So we still haven't gotten to the part with Woz and Jobs, except for the sort of in the prologue. It's interesting to note, though, that they're not the only players that, well, they're far from the only players that actually had, they weren't the only pirates. I guess that's the best way to put it. In fact, one of the pirates was a captain. Talk to me about Captain Crunch, the Blue Box, and how they tie in to Cupertino.
Believe it or not, Apple's founders made a start by selling phreaking equipment. We could trace Apple's involvement in this scene ultimately back to a man named John Draper, better known by his popular nickname Captain Crunch. And I could tell you, I hope he's listening to this podcast, because he once advised us and other people at our first Macworld we ever exhibited at that we should listen to his podcast. So here's my time to tell him he should be listening to ours. So the phreaking scene was already alive and well in the early 70s, with several individuals using cassette recordings of instruments playing tones that were close enough to trigger call switching. At the time, Draper was exploring the operation of pirate radio stations when he met an individual who introduced him to a group of established phreakers. Collaboration with these people led him deeper into the subculture and to his unique nickname. Now, some years prior, Captain Crunch cereal packed in a small toy whistle as its in-box prize. It was supposed to sound like a captain's whistle, but it sounded like something else too. By blocking up one of the whistle's air holes, it produced a perfect 2600 hertz tone. Now, phreakers who had one of these whistles could skip the process of trying to learn how to make the right sound themselves. Draper took the nickname Captain Crunch for himself as he delved into the world of phreaking. His exploits, especially with the device known as a blue box, eventually landed him in trouble with the authorities, but not before he had been interviewed for a magazine article. It was this article that captured the attention of Jobs and Wozniak and led Woz on a journey to track down Captain Crunch for an in-person meeting. Both Jobs and Woz learned more about the ins and outs of phreaking from the captain. Coincidentally, Draper was also a member of the same computer club that would see the birth of the Apple I some years later. Because this next part of the story is important, let's talk about what a blue box actually is. A blue box is a very simple device. It's hardware that could generate a 2600 hertz idling tone without the need of anything else. Blue boxes also often feature their own keypads. This allowed users to immediately dial in the next number or telephone exchange they wanted to call. There were many other phreaking boxes out there by the 90s, each one designed to interact and manipulate the phone systems in different ways. But to satisfy his own curiosity, Wozniak, he had spent a lot of time trying to develop a blue box that didn't rely on inaccurate analog tone generators. After he and Jobs had discovered the tone specifications in documentation at a technical library that they had access to, Woz went to work. The eventual result was perhaps the very first digital blue box, and it worked perfectly. Captain Crunch taught Wozniak more in-depth blue boxing techniques, like making international calls, and both he and Jobs went deeper into the freaking scene. Woz's love of practical jokes even led him to call Vatican City once. He impersonated Henry Kissinger by putting on a fake German accent and asked to speak to the Pope. He got pretty far, but he was finally busted as a phony. While he didn't get to actually talk to the Pope, he got close. And that's what it was all about. Ultimately, Jobs suggested they make more of these blue boxes and sell them to other college students and enthusiasts. This was their first business venture together, so you could argue Apple got its start selling illegal phone tampering equipment. And they did booming business. It would lead them to incorporate Apple later.
Yeah, I guess it is important. I mean, when Jobs talked about, the pirate culture at Apple, I mean, they did have a building over which to fly a flag. It's sort of important to, somewhere there is a line between, there are a couple of guys who are pranking the Vatican to, they are a company actually making computers. And hey, speaking of computers, there is sort of this mythical gathering. It's not really mythical. And I think its members actually still gather, some of them anyway. Talk to me about the role of the Homebrew Computer Club in Apple's germination.
Sure. Well, the connection between Apple and the hacking scene of that era goes beyond the wider phreaking scene and the construction of those blue boxes. In the mid-70s, the idea of a personal computer was a brand new concept. Miniaturization had only recently progressed to the point where such an advancement was even possible. As a result, computers were largely the domain of dedicated hobbyists and those who worked with them professionally. Remember how we mentioned that the Apple I needed a whole lot of build time on the part of the user? Well, that was totally normal back then. And it was an early experience with hand-built computers that inspired Woz to commence work on what would later become the Apple I. So another quick history lesson. At the very beginning of 1975, the first real PC became available to hobbyists, the Altair 8800. It wasn't a pre-assembled computer like you'd expect, but instead a kit with the core parts that one would need to build it. The Altair had no graphical display. Instead, it used lights as indicators and little switches on the front to program it. After its appearance on the cover of Popular Electronics magazine, mail orders flowed in for it, which was groundbreaking for its time. Never before was there such a popularity when it came to what had previously been a small hobby. One of those orders came out of California, placed by an enthusiast in Menlo Park. When the kit arrived, a group of computer hobbyists from the area, Wozniak among them, gathered in a garage to examine the machine and discuss the technology. It was the very first meeting of what would come to be known as the Homebrew Computer Club. The experience here with the Altair would immediately inspire Wozniak to begin creating a computer of his own. He was aware that it could be done better, faster, and provide more utility to the user. Thus, the Apple I was born, almost entirely out of a desire to impress people in the club. These physical hacks and hardware creations are a far cry from the way we use the word today. Wozniak himself has said that without these computer clubs and the gathering space they provided, there would never have been an Apple computer at all. That would have meant that there was nothing for Steve Jobs to project his vision onto, and no Apple II or any of the other products that we've come to know and love. If you're curious about Apple's history and the history of Silicon Valley, you cannot overstate the importance of the Homebrew Computer Club.
So what's really weird is, and we've heard this, if you've ever seen any of the movies, some of them good, some of them bad, if you've ever seen any of the movies about the early days of Apple, or if you've ever read anything about the very beginnings of Apple, there came to be this fight At least that's the way it's presented between Jobs and Woz about whether or not all this stuff should be open and free, or, not free, because obviously you wanted to make money selling them, but whether this stuff should be open and the information readily available to, should it be locked down and maybe not as readily available. Flash forward to the iPhone, which was the first smartphone that didn't have, or one of the first smartphones that didn't have a replaceable battery. And most of your computers that you get from Apple today, I guess all of the computers you get from Apple today actually don't have a replaceable battery. I mean, there was this openness about everything they did initially. The devices themselves, the hardware itself is much more closed today. And yet, I don't know, there is this, as you mentioned a minute ago, there's this pirate culture that sort of still kind of exists around the whole Apple ethos. I guess the question I have is, where would you say the hacker spirit or the pirate spirit or the combination of those things, where do they exist today?
Well, it's not the same, that's for sure. Phreaking was on its way out in the early 90s as the telephone companies transitioned to out-of-band signaling, handling all the switching with the transmission separate from the main phone line. The switching to digital voice transmission in the early 2000s was the final nail in the coffin for phreaking. As for hacking, it has and it hasn't changed. Today, most people know hackers as the malicious authors of the malware that attack and infect our computers. Relying on that as our definition, it's too simple. The original spirit of learning to tinker with, modify, and create computers and software, it still exists. All you need to do is look at DEF CON or any of the other major hacking conventions to see it. So, how can you today experience the same kind of community that made Apple possible? Attending a big conference isn't the only way to immerse yourself in the hacker culture of today. There are surprisingly large numbers of very active weekly hacker and computer enthusiasts gathering around the world. These preserve a spirit similar to the ones embodied by the original Homebrew Club. They offer opportunities to interact with and learn from others who share the same similar passions for technology. You could even go a step beyond, though. These groups and many others are at the forefront of a new wave of hacker spaces. You'll also sometimes hear hacker spaces referred to as maker spaces. These are communal spaces where individuals can gather to work individually or within a group on a passion project. It might be hacking together a basic robotic system, tinkering with a coding project, or trying to launch some new software. Many makerspaces encourage the exploration of Arduino-based hardware. The growing popularity of technology like 3D printing is having a significant influence on these spaces too. As an intersection between art, technology, and design, 3D printing is producing an incredible amount of new ideas. Now, technology is always changing. Think back 10 years ago, and everything from computers to phones, TVs, all look primitive compared to what we have now. There's always innovation happening, and there is always someone at the boundary of cutting-edge tech, exploring, experimenting, and innovating. It's not the only way the best new development occurs, but it's certainly a major source. Hacker spaces are often more welcoming than you might expect. There are major organized spaces as well as small, locally owned projects run by people who love what they do. What could be closer to emulating the original Homebrew Computer Club than that? These spaces and the boundless creativity of those who work within them could be setting the stage for the Apple computer of tomorrow. We already hear words like disruptive thrown about, innovators who bring a radically new product to the market. As individuals continue to come together in the spirit of collaboration, who knows? The next Apple might be in its formative stages inside someone's garage right now.
It's an interesting idea. I mean, what's weird is the kinds of things that I think about as far as where those are now, like, I guess we're always either coming close to or we've just had a WWDC. As we sit here and record this, WWDC is just about to happen. And they introduced a thing this week where Swift Playgrounds, which is the thing that's supposed to teach kids how to, program in Swift, which is the language they introduced a couple of years ago, can now work with robots and drones put out by a number of companies. So it's not quite the hacker thing where like you build your own robot and then you give it its own whatever. And yet at the same time, I mean, they are sort of like they are putting things out still today that sort of they sort of run the thread between, okay, this is a thing that happens on your phone, or this is a thing that happens on your computer, and this is a thing that happens in real life. I mean, yes, they may be looking at, okay, so these kids are going to grow up and they're going to start the next billion-dollar company. But it may also just be like illustrating for kids, hey, this thing that's happening on this screen, can actually happen in the real world as well.
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, my kids, every Kickstarter project that I see that incorporates learning with playing, I mean, whether it be robotics or anything else, I get for my kids because they want to play. But if I could put it in front of them and they could play with it, they're learning. They're learning the programming side of things without even knowing what they're doing. And that sets up the next generation right there.
There's this whole other thing, too, that I was thinking about as we were doing this show. It's a quote that's often attributed to Isaac Asimov. And apparently you can't really say that he said these exact words in this exact way. But it's a phrase that you hear sometimes. The most exciting phrase to hear in science, the one that heralds new discoveries, is not eureka, I found it, but the phrase, that's funny. So, I mean, it's also just like, it's kind of just like noticing things, right? It's noticing that tone thing that they, noticed forever ago. I mean, hacks are kind of waiting to be found, it seems. I mean, if you're just kind of, if instead of just looking at your screen, you're kind of, metaphorically speaking, looking behind the screen, I would think.
Exactly. It's that spirit of exploration and discovery and that drive to learn new things or figure out how something works. It's kind of the driving force behind all this innovation.
Now, have you guys actually got to build your own blue box or red box or any of these other fun things on your own? Or is that something you're not going to admit to now because, we just don't?
Me personally, no, but I did have a friend who had one. And I think he told me that for like $25, I think that he could give me one. But $25 was like $1,000 when I was, that age. So sadly, I was aware of that segment of the population, but I missed out on being part of it myself.
Oh yeah, I remember going to Radio Shack, getting the different crystals, all the different equipment that you needed to do these different things, and insert some legal mumbo jumbo here.
Statute of limitations, I would hope, is run out on rooking AT&T out of 50 cents for a phone call.
I loved the electronic kits when I was a kid. I would kind of, I guess probably to the consternation of my parents, would take apart a lot of my toys, figure out how they worked, the electronic ones, put them back together, make them do something different. I always, managed to get all the parts back together for the most part, so they didn't get too mad, but I loved that stuff when I was a kid.
How many extra pieces did you have?
Oh, occasionally the missing screw or two.
That's awesome.
So We've talked a lot about sort of the spirit of hacking. We've certainly touched on a few names. There's actually a great website that people can check out if you want to know more stories from people on the ground and from people who were on the ground with these names at the time. Folklore.org is actually a good story, a good site, excuse me. They've actually got the story of the pirate flag that was mentioned earlier, and a bunch of other stuff to check out there. So spelled like it sounds, Folklore. At least that's how I think it sounds, folklore.org. Of course, we covered a lot of information on this episode. If you missed any part of it or want to go back and dig a bit deeper into the stuff that we covered, there's a website to do that. It is securemac.com/checklist. That's where notes for today's show and past shows and future shows will be. securemac.com/checklist. If you have questions for us, or if you have a topic you'd like to hear us hit, our email address is checklist@securemac.com. The address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, please do remember this. You are listening to The Checklist by Secure Mac. And we'll talk to you next week.